Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 60th deck and it's titled Blue-ristocrats. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. Now, really quickly before we get into everything that we're going to talk about, I do know that the formatting of this video is a little bit off this week, and I do apologize for that. Trust me, I've tried everything in my power to try to fix it, but unfortunately, that's just how it's got to be. So hopefully, the formatting can kind of get back on track next week, but hopefully you don't mind a little bit of deviation there. So with that, I suppose, disclaimer out of the way, let's jump into our shout-outs and our social media accounts for this week. So, as always, if you are interested in reaching out to us, you can always send us a message over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, on Reddit at u/POYNZ13. I know the two are backwards. It's a pain in the butt. You could also send us an email at dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. If you reach out to me on any of those three platforms, I will be more than happy to respond to you as quickly as I can. Those are great places to suggest new cards that you'd like to see for decks or for videos, or if you just have general suggestions for the channel in general, or if you just want to chat, those are great ways to let me know. And if you're interested in supporting our content a little bit more directly, you can always, of course, use our affiliate link with tcgplayer.com. Any purchases you make through their website, we get a little bit of kickback from that, so that is very much appreciated. And then even more directly, you could support our content through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/thedungeonlearnersguide, and there you get access to a ton of different stuff depending on the level that you pick. You could get things like getting access to the deck lists a week early. You could get access to the full unedited gameplay videos, so you can see all the unedited games that are going on, all the plays that kind of get cut out, or all the dead space that kind of gets cut out, plus all the fun commentary made by all of the players. And then, of course, there's other things like being able to participate in the games, being able to join a Discord for all of that. And right now, all of that money is going toward finding a way to record in-person games, because I would love to bring some in-person games to everybody as well. So if any of that is something you're interested in, please do help support us in that way. If, however, none of that is your style, you are, as always, welcome to like the video, subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. And at this point, we are getting very, very close to 200 subscribers. So I would love to hit that mark. And I appreciate everyone who has helped us make everything we've done so far possible. So a quick thank you. And of course, can't move on without shouting out our patron, William Swiftfoot, who, if you didn't see the video, was in the video last week. So one of the perks of being a patron, of course. And there is one last shout out I want to make before we move on this week, and that is to the Underground Sea. And if you haven't seen what's going on over with the Underground Sea, they do a ton of videos focusing on little, almost bite-sized deck tech. So they focus heavily on primers and talking about what a deck is good at, whether it's Commander, whether it's Legacy, anything like that. And they have been working with us these past few weeks and past few months, really, to put out primers for some of our videos. And their most recent one was Marton Stromgald, which they put out about 9 days ago as I'm recording this, which I know our last video came out before then, but because of the way recording happened, it didn't quite work out. So if you get the chance, please do check them out. They're great, and they're very accommodating to all of their viewers, trying to make sure that everyone kind of knows what's going on. So they're shouting us out. I feel definitely only fair if we shout them out in return. So Underground Sea, thank you very much for all of the support, and hopefully we can both help each other to grow a little bit. But I suppose that is all of our shout-outs for this week. So the next thing to do then would be to take a look at our random card. And this week, our random card is suggested to us by my good friend Jason, who shows up on the channel quite a bit. You've probably seen him in quite a few of the games so far. And one thing to know about Jason, or I suppose two things, is that he is a big fan of blue. It's his go-to color. And he's a big fan of aristocrats. But he's never quite been able to make the mono blue aristocrat strategy work. So that was why for this week he suggested Abjure. And Abjure is 1 blue mana for an interrupt, or it would be an instant now, for sacrifice a blue permanent, counter target spell. So we are going to attempt to make Jason's dream come true. We're going to try to create a mono blue aristocrats deck, hence the name Blue-ristocrats. And we're going to see how that pans out for us. Hopefully, it'll wind up being pretty good. And of course, if we're playing mono blue aristocrats, we do need a commander to go with it. And this week, our commander is going to be Geralf, Visionary Stitcher. Geralf is 2 and a blue for a legendary creature, human wizard. He's a 1/4, and he says zombies you control have flying, and pay a blue, tap, sacrifice another non-token creature, create an XX blue zombie creature token, where X is the sacrificed creature's toughness. So most Geralf decks I've seen in the past have been very focused on the zombie aspect of this. Zombie tribal in mono blue, making zombies have flying, being able to make big zombie tokens. But really, we want Geralf in this deck because he lets us sacrifice our creatures. And not only that, he lets us sacrifice our non-token creatures and make a token creature, meaning that we can essentially replace each of our non-token creatures with a token, giving us more things to sacrifice as the game progresses. So Geralf is phenomenal for what we're trying to do, and we're hoping to kind of build around that ability just a little bit. So that is our commander and our random card, which obviously leads us into some themes for this deck. And we have talked about one already, but I do think it's important to highlight it again, and that is sacrifice. We want to sacrifice as many of our creatures as possible to get as much value out of them as possible. So as an example of that, we have Grafted War Gear, which is 3 mana for an artifact equipment. And it says equipped creature gets +3/+2, and whenever Grafted War Gear becomes unattached from a permanent, sacrifice that permanent, equip 0. So as long as we have 2 creatures, we can equip Grafted War Gear to one of those creatures for free, and then equip it to the other one for free, sacrificing the original creature, meaning that this is essentially a free sacrifice outlet, provided we have more than one creature on the board. There aren't too many free sacrifice outlets that we were able to fit into the deck, but as many as we can get, that's what we want to be doing. We want to sacrifice our creatures and just get a ton of value from those creatures dying, which, speaking of creatures dying, leads us into our second theme, which is going to be, well, creatures dying and having abilities. So as an example of that, we have Chasm Skulker, which is 2 and a blue for a 1/1 squid horror. Whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Chasm Skulker, and when Chasm Skulker dies, put X 1/1 blue squid creature tokens with Island Walk onto the battlefield, where X is the number of +1/+1 counters on Chasm Skulker. So anytime Chasm Skulker dies, we get to make additional tokens, which could then be sacrificed again to hopefully continue our value train going. And Chasm Skulker also plays into a great second theme of this deck, which we'll get into in just a second, which is drawing cards. We need to make sure that our deck keeps its hand nice and full so we can continue to play cards like Chasm Skulker and Grafted War Gear and keep sacrificing them. Most of that card draw is going to be on creatures, but when we get to our third theme here, you'll notice it's not all about the creatures. So for example, we have Flow of Ideas, which is 5 and a blue for a sorcery that says draw a card for each island you control. Since we're mono blue, we're going to have a ton of islands. And Flow of Ideas, if we have no ramp, will most likely be 6 mana, draw 6 cards, which is very good. But in the late game, it can be even better. And that pairs super well with all of our creatures that when they die, we draw cards, or creatures like Chasm Skulker that just get bigger when we draw cards. So once we fill up our hand, we draw a ton of cards, play out all those cards, get a bunch of creatures, sacrifice a bunch of creatures, get a bunch of triggers. Hopefully, that will lead us to winning the game. That is our main hope here and our main goal. And to help us on our themes and help us to our victory, hopefully at least our victory, we also have some key cards. Some cards that we really want to get into play that are going to help us do pretty much everything we want to do. The first of those key cards is going to be a bit of a weird one. It's Homarid Spawning Bed. And Homarid Spawning Bed is blue for an enchantment. You can pay 1 blue, sacrifice a blue creature to put X Camerid tokens into play, where X is the casting cost of the sacrificed creature. Treat these tokens as 1/1 blue creatures. So in other words, we pay 3 mana, we sacrifice a blue creature. It doesn't necessarily say non-token, but because it makes X Camerids, where X is the casting cost of the creature, sacrificing a token just gets us 0 Camerids. So we really don't want it to be a token, but I suppose it could be. But this allows us to turn our non-token creatures into more creatures, giving us more things to sacrifice, more value for our deck. So this is perfect for what we're trying to do. And I really don't know if I've ever seen this card played. I think it's very good in very specific decks, and I'm hoping this deck is one of those decks. And our next key card is Murder of Crows, which is 3 blue for a 4/4 creature bird. It's got flying, and whenever another creature dies, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So we mentioned earlier that a lot of our creatures, when they die, they actually draw a card anyway, but Murder of Crows makes sure that no matter what, every single creature that dies draws us a card, and yeah, we may have to discard a card, but it's still card selection. It lets us kind of churn through our deck a little bit faster and get the things that we need in order to try to win the game. And if we partner that up with something like Homarid Spawning Bed, we're able to sacrifice the tokens it creates too. Murder of Crows doesn't specify non-token creatures, making it a very powerful card when we're sacrificing a ton of permanents. And finally, last but certainly not least, our final key card of the deck is Fade Away. And Fade Away is a card that I believe has shown up in some of our decks before. I think it was highlighted in our Taniwa deck. But Fade Away is 2 and a blue for a sorcery that says for each creature, that creature's controller pays 1 or sacrifices a permanent. So if our opponents are completely tapped out and they have, say, 10 creatures, we're going to force them to pay 10 mana, which they can't, and therefore we'll have to sacrifice 10 permanents. They could sacrifice their creatures, they could sacrifice lands, artifacts, enchantments, whatever, but they have to sacrifice something. So this is perfect for what we're trying to do, because this is essentially a mono blue board wipe, or it's a massive sacrifice outlet for us, because we might be able to pay for it. Maybe we want to keep our creatures around, but on the off chance we don't, this allows us to just say, I'm not going to pay the 1, and we can sacrifice all of our creatures whenever we want. So Fade Away, absolute all-star in this deck, does really great things, especially in mono blue. So very happy to highlight it, and I do think it's definitely a key card for this deck. But with the key cards out of the way, let's take a look at some cool interactions in this deck. Some cards that work super well together, that kind of focus our synergy a little bit more. The first cool interaction that we're going to talk about is between Inga Rune-Eyes and Reefworm. So Inga Rune-Eyes was actually almost the commander for this deck, but we went with Geralf instead. Inga says for 3 and a blue, she's a 3/3 legendary creature, human wizard, and when she enters the battlefield, scry 3, and when she dies, you draw 3 cards if 3 or more creatures died this turn. And if we partner that up with Reefworm, which is 3 and a blue for a worm, it's a 0/1. When it dies, you make a 3/3 fish. When the fish dies, you make a 6/6 whale. When the whale dies, you make a 9/9 kraken. So by partnering up Inga and Reefworm, we can essentially get Inga's trigger off of just 2 creatures. We can draw 3 cards with 3 or more creatures dying, even though we've only got the 2 creatures. because all we'd have to do is kill the reefworm and then kill the fish that reefworm makes. We get a whale, and then we kill Inga, and all of a sudden we get to draw 3 cards, and really we're only down 2 cards, maybe even just a card and a half, because we still have a 6/6 whale on the board. So Inga and reefworm can be incredibly powerful when partnered together, and honestly, incredibly powerful just on their own. These are great cards in the mono blue sacrifice deck, and even together, much stronger. So that is cool interaction number 1. And cool interaction number 2 focuses on Floodgate and Ether Barrier. So Floodgate is 3 and a blue for a wall. It's a 0/5. And if Floodgate gains flying, bury it. If Floodgate leaves play, it deals to each non-blue creature without flying 1 damage for each 2 islands you control. So this is a super weird card, but essentially, if it ever dies, we get to do 1 damage for every 2 islands we control. So if we control 4 islands, we do 2 damage, and so on. That normally would not be super great because, yeah, it's a board wipe, but it's super unreliable. We never really know when it's going to die. We don't really know what's going to happen with it. But in this deck, when we can sacrifice things at instant speed, this becomes an instant speed board wipe in mono blue. That's not bouncing things back to our opponent's hands, it's just killing them. So Floodgate can be incredibly powerful if we use it correctly. And so to use it correctly, we're going to pair that up with Aether Barrier. An Aether Barrier is 2 and a blue for an enchantment that says whenever a player plays a creature spell, that player sacrifices a permanent unless they pay 1. This means that if any of our opponents play creatures, they're sacrificing permanents or paying 1, which is great because that's going to hinder their game plan. It's going to slow them down a little bit. But that also means that if we play anything, that's a free sacrifice outlet for our Floodgate. We can just wipe the board at a moment's notice, especially if we play any creatures with flash. Anything we play on our opponent's turn, any tokens we might make, can help us trigger Floodgate and get anything off of the board that might be in our way. So a very cool interaction, and again, just like with Inga and the Reform, I think these 2 cards are very powerful on their own, but I do think that together is where they really shine. Now, that leads us to the end of our deck tech, and obviously since we're talking about a budget deck, we should probably talk about the budget of the deck itself, and this week the total price came out to $67.23, and believe it or not, even with that low of a price, we were still able to squeeze in an $11 card in Aura Thief. Aura Thief is 3 and a blue for an illusion. It's a 2/2. It's got flying, and when Aura Thief is put into a graveyard from play, you gain control of all enchantments. In Commander, there's usually at least a couple of enchantments floating around, and we might get lucky and play against an enchantment-based deck, in which case we can kind of just take their whole battlefield. So Aura Thief can be incredibly powerful, especially because we can sacrifice it at instant speed most of the time. Being able to get its trigger on our opponent's turns, maybe they think that their enchantments are safe until it comes to our turn. Nope, we can sacrifice it, get them all, and then we're good to go. So Aura Thief, if you have one, or if you don't mind spending the money to get it, can be a very powerful inclusion in this deck, but it is an $11 card, and cutting it out of the deck brings the price down to almost $55, so definitely something to consider if you're looking to drop the price a little bit. And on the other hand, maybe you're trying to increase the price of the deck a little bit, or you just want to bring the deck all the way up to its full $100 budget limit. And if that's the case, I do have one suggestion for you this week, and that is the card Lifeline. Lifeline is 5 mana for an artifact that says whenever a creature is put into a graveyard and a creature is in play, return that creature from your graveyard to play at the end of turn. Now, this is worded a little bit strangely, but in essence what it means is if there's ever a creature in play, whenever any other creature dies, it comes back to play at the end of turn. That could be our creatures, that could be our opponent's creatures, but since we're sacrificing everything at instant speed, or at least hopefully at instant speed, that means we're going to be able to get a little bit more advantage out of this than our opponents will. We're going to be able to sacrifice our board every single turn, get it back at the end step, and then do it again. So this is an absolutely phenomenal card for what we're trying to do, but it is unfortunately $37, so it didn't make it into the budget for this week. However, if you have one or you're interested, feel free to throw it in and try it out, see how it works. So that is our deck for the week. The last piece of this actual deck tech, though, and I'm not quite sure if you could call it part of the deck tech as much as it is just gameplay, we need to test this deck out. We need to see how it works against some opponents. So this week we are joined by Shawn, Bilal, and Jason, who are playing Goshin Tai of Life's Origin, Ishin, Two Heavens as One, and Elenda the Dusk Rose. So Shawn, playing his Goshin Tai of Life's Origin deck, is an enchantment-based deck, so Aura Thief might come in handy here. And what he's trying to do is get a ton of shrines into play and just trigger all of the shrine abilities as much as possible and try to win through value and kind of just drawing more cards, doing more damage, and just in general just doing more things than his opponents. Next up is Bilal's Ishin, Two Heavens as One deck. This is an attacking strategy. He wants to swing in a ton of creatures, get a ton of attack triggers that trigger an additional time. So anything that attacks and actually does something when it attacks, he now gets that ability twice. So his goal is to kind of beat people down and also still accrue some value as he goes. And then last, we have Jason's Elenda the Dusk Rose deck. This is another aristocrat deck, very similar to ours. So he wants to kill a ton of creatures, get a bunch of triggers, and just kind of slowly grind out his opponents. I'm very interested to see how our aristocrats match up against his. I think he has more powerful cards for the archetype, but we are probably going to have more card draw, so hopefully it kind of evens out. But I am very interested to see how this game goes. I hope you are as well. And I hope you all enjoy it, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Shawn goes first, followed by Bilal, Jason, and then myself. On Shawn's first turn, he plays a Ketria Triome. Bilal plays a Spectator Seating. Jason plays a Shattered Sanctum. I play an Island. Shawn plays a Mountain and casts Soul Ring, and then casts Kodama's Reach, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into his hand. Bilal plays a Command Tower and casts Glint Sleeve Siphoner, getting an energy when it enters and attacks, then being able to pay 2 energy in his upkeep to draw a card and lose a life. Jason casts a Blood Pet, which can be sacrificed for a black mana, and plays a Godless Shrine tapped. I play an Island and cast a Mind Stone. Shawn plays a Swamp and casts Sanctum Weaver, which taps for mana equal to the number of enchantments he controls, and then casts Gen Arcanum Weaver, which can sacrifice an enchantment to return an enchantment to play from the graveyard. Bilal plays a Plains and casts his commander Ishin, Two Heavens as One, which doubles the attack triggers for his permanents. He then attacks Jason for 2, making 2 energy. Jason plays a Plains and casts Phyrexian Arena, allowing him to draw a card and lose a life on his upkeep. I play an Island and cast Stitcher's Apprentice, which can be activated to make a 2/2 Homunculus and then forces me to sacrifice a creature. After that, I cast a Spawning Pit, which can sacrifice a creature to put a charge counter on it, which I can then remove 2 counters to make a 2/2 Spawn token. Shawn plays a Sandstep Citadel, and then casts his commander Goshin Tai of Life's Origin, creating a 1/1 Shrine creature token whenever a shrine enters the battlefield, also making one for itself entering. He then casts a Sphere of Safety, making each opponent pay X to attack him with a creature, where X is the number of enchantments he controls, which is currently 4. In his upkeep, Bilal spends 2 mana to draw a card and lose a life. He then plays a Temple of Triumph, scrying 1, and casts Fervor, giving all his creatures haste. He then moves to combat, attacking me for 2, gaining 2 energy. In Jason's upkeep, he draws a card and loses a life, and then plays a swamp and casts his commander, Alenda the Dusk Rose, which gets a +1/+1 counter on her whenever another creature dies, and also creates X 1/1 vampire tokens when she dies, where X is her power. On my turn, I play an island and pass. Shawn plays a Sanctum of Saturn Heights, making a shrine token and giving him the ability to discard a land or shrine to do damage to a creature or planeswalker equal to the number of shrines he controls. In Bilal's upkeep, he pays 2 energy to draw a card and lose a life, and then plays a Plains and casts Leonin Warleader, making so that whenever he attacks, he makes 2 1/1 cat tokens with lifelink that are tapped and attacking. He then casts a Mardu Shadow Spear, which makes each opponent lose a life when it attacks. Before combat though, I cast Fact or Fiction, revealing the top 5 cards of my library and letting Jason separate them into 2 piles, putting one into my hand and the other into my graveyard. This has me choosing to put Fade Away and Perilous Research into my hand. Still before combat, I cast a Rapid Hybridization to destroy Ishin and replace him with a 3/3 Frog Lizard. Bilal then attacks me for 13 with his entire board, including the newly created cat tokens, and this gives him an energy and also makes each opponent lose a life. Then I block the Shadow Spear, taking 12, killing the Shadow Spear, while Bilal gains 2. Jason casts a Smothering Tithe, making each opponent pay 2 mana every time they draw a card or Jason makes a treasure token. When I draw for my turn, I don't pay the 2, making Jason a treasure. I then play an island and cast Fade Away, making each player pay 1 mana for each creature they control or sacrificing a permanent for each one they can't pay. In response, Shawn casts a Beast Within on Alenda, destroying her and making Jason 4 vampire tokens and a beast token. Then the board wipe resolves and results in Shawn sacrificing 1 shrine and paying for the rest, Bilal sacrificing all his creatures, and Jason sacrificing his treasure to keep Blood Pet but losing everything else, and I pay for my 1 creature. When Shawn draws, he doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, making Jason a treasure, and then cast Helm of the Host, equipping it to his commander, allowing him to make a non-legendary copy of it when he goes to combat. Before combat, I cast Reality Shift to exile Goshen Tai and allow Shawn to manifest the top card of his library. But, in response, Shawn casts a Dovin's Veto, countering my spell. This lets him go to combat and make another copy of his commander, making another 2 shrine tokens when it enters. Technically, it should have only made 1 since the copy is a token and Goshen Tai doesn't trigger when tokens enter, but we don't catch that at the time. He then goes to combat and attacks Bilal with his entire board for 9 total damage. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Plains, and then casts a Mardu Ascendancy, making a 1/1 Goblin token whenever he attacks with a non-token creature. Jason plays a Plains and casts Pious Evangel, gaining a life whenever a creature enters under his control, and he casts a Grim Haruspects, drawing a card whenever a creature dies under his control. He then sacrifices his Blood Pet for a black mana, drawing a card, and casts Remorseful Cleric, gaining a life. I play a Ghost Quarter, and then cast my commander, Geralf Visionary Stitcher. When Shawn draws for his turn, he pays the 2 mana to prevent Jason from making a treasure, which is something Bilal and I did not do, and he then casts Sanctum of Tranquil Light, making 2 shrine tokens, and moves to combat, making yet another token copy of his commander, creating 3 shrine tokens. Again, this should have only been 1, but we miss it at the time. He then attacks Jason for 9 and Bilal for 5. Bilal plays a mountain, and then casts Farewell, exiling all artifacts, enchantments, creatures, and graveyards. In response, Jason sacrifices his Remorseful Cleric to exile Bilal's graveyard and draw a card. Still in response, I sacrifice my Mind Stone to draw a card, and then the board wipe resolves, clearing everything away. On Jason's turn, he casts a Dictate of Erebos, forcing each opponent to sacrifice a creature whenever one of his creatures dies. I cast Inga Rune Eyes, scrying 3 when she enters. Shawn plays a Plains and recasts Goshen Tai, making a Shrine token when it enters. Bilal casts a Gilded Lotus, casts an Orzhov Signet, and then casts Bruce Tarl Boorish Hoarder, which gives another creature lifelink and double strike until end of turn whenever he attacks. Jason plays a Swamp and casts Teysa Orzhov Scion, which can sacrifice 3 white creatures to exile a creature, and also creates a 1/1 white spirit token whenever one of his black creatures dies. After that, he casts a Ministrant of Obligation. I cast a Reefworm, which makes a 3/3 fish when it dies. Shawn plays an Opulent Palace and passes. Bilal plays a Blood Crypt untapped, paying 2 life, and recasts his commander Ishin. He then casts a Drakuseth Maw of Flames before moving to combat and attacking me for 3 with Bruce Tarl, giving himself lifelink and double strike on attacks. I decide to block with my Reefworm, but before the damage, I cast Perilous Research, drawing 2 cards and sacrificing the worm, getting a 3/3 fish that, when it dies, makes a 6/6 whale token and denying Bilal the life gain. Jason plays a Plains and casts Cathar's Crusade, putting a +1/+1 counter on each creature he controls whenever another creature enters the battlefield under his control. He then casts a Despark, exiling Drakuseth. I play an Island and cast Mere Sire, which creates a 1/1 Mere token when it dies, and then I cast a Grafted Wargear, which equips for 0, giving a creature +3/+2, but when it becomes unequipped, I have to sacrifice the creature that it was equipped to. I equip the Wargear to Mere Sire, and then immediately re-equip it to the fish token, killing the Sire and making a 1/1 Mere token. I then re-equip the Wargear again, this time to Inga, killing the fish and creating a 6/6 whale token that, when it dies, makes a 9/9 Kraken token. I then go to combat, attacking Shawn for 6 with Inga. Then, in my second main phase, I re-equip the Wargear to the whale, killing Inga, and, since 3 creatures died this turn, I also draw 3 cards with her ability. Still in my second main phase, I cast a Culling Dais and then pass. Shawn plays a Forest and passes. Bilal casts a Mind Stone, immediately sacrificing it to draw a card, and then casts a Hammer of Perforos, giving all his creatures haste. He then moves to combat, attacking Jason with both of his creatures for a total of 12 thanks to the double strike and lifelink from Bruce Tarl, and Jason blocks Ishin with the Ministrant of Obligation, creating 2 spirit tokens when it dies thanks to Afterlife, and also making each opponent sacrifice a creature. Then Jason takes 6 and gains 12, while all his creatures get 2 +1/+1 counters. Jason plays a Marsh Flats, sacrificing it to search his library for a Plains, putting it into play. He then recasts his commander Elenda, putting a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures, and casts a Murder Investigation on Elenda, making it so that when she dies, she creates X 1/1 soldier tokens where X is her power. He then moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 8 in the air. At the end of his turn, I sacrifice the whale to the Culling Dais, putting a charge counter on it, putting a counter on Elenda, and making a 9/9 Kraken token. On my turn, I play a High Market and cast Carnage Altar, allowing me to pay 3 mana, sacrifice a creature, and draw a card. After that, I cast a Filigree Familiar, gaining 2 life, and I also cast a Cathodian. Shawn casts a Starfield Mystic, making all his enchantments cost 1 less. Bilal plays a Plains and passes. Jason casts a Gift of Immortality on Elenda, allowing her to return to play if she dies. He also casts a Pawn of Ulamog, making an Eldrazi spawn whenever any of his non-token creatures dies, and putting +1/+1 counters on all of his creatures. He then moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 10 in the air. Then, at the end of turn, I sacrifice Cathodian to Culling Dais, putting a charge counter on it and making 3 mana. This lets me activate Carnage Altar to sacrifice Filigree Familiar, drawing 2 cards, and this also puts 2 more counters on Elenda. On my turn, I play an Island and cast Grafted Identity, sacrificing the Kraken and gaining control of Jason's Teysa. In response, Jason activates Teysa, sacrificing his spirits and Elenda, exiling Goshen Tai and killing all of his opponent's creatures. Then, he creates 17 tokens, all of them getting 17 +1/+1 counters, leaving us all dead on his turn, and since nobody could draw an answer, we all concede, winning Jason the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Everyone's deck really kind of got to do what it wanted to do. Shawn made a ton of enchantments, a ton of shrines, and really looked like the threat very early on. And if it hadn't been for the farewell, I think he probably could have wound up winning. So definitely a very terrifying start from his deck. Bilal's Ishin deck also very powerful, did what it kind of wanted to do, played a bunch of creatures, and there were a few key creatures that I think if they hadn't been removed, I think he would have been in a much better position. That Drakuseth especially could have done a ton of damage if it were allowed to attack, and I wouldn't be surprised if he had been able to sneak out a win as well at some point. Jason, his aristocrats really did what they were trying to do. I mean, he won the game, so obviously he's doing something right. And I think the amount of tokens he was able to generate, especially with Cathar's Crusade, meant that there really wasn't anything we could do. We tried to find a board wipe, tried to find something to stop him, but unfortunately, none of us could really come up with anything, letting him win. And in the end, I think our deck performed well. I think that we drew a ton of cards and did really what we wanted to do, but we couldn't, unfortunately, find any big payoffs for our aristocrat strategies. So we didn't quite do as well as we wanted, but it was still pretty cool to see the deck go off and do what it was built to do. So I am very happy with how it turned out. I hope you are as well. And if you have any suggestions for any future videos, please do let me know in the comments. Please do let me know on our social media. You can send us an email and like the video and subscribe to the channel. And other than that, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.